there will come a point where no job is needed. You can have a job if you want to have a job. The AI will be able to do everything.
AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs in the next 1 to 5 years.
I'm about to graduate college, and I'm so worried there's going to be no jobs left for me.
Welcome to AI Unplugged, the future of work, unlocking the promise and peril of the algorithmic age.
So hello, listeners. A very warm welcome to AI Unplugged, the Future of Work podcast. I am Warren Valdmanis, alongside my friend Deval Patrick. Deval, how are you today?
Warren, I am well, and I'm glad to be back with you and trying to make some sense of the explosion in AI activity all around the world and all around our lives. And we have a really great guest today who can help us make some sense of it. She's been a longtime labor leader and the head for many, many years of the fastest growing labor union in America, the SEIU. Mary Kay Henry, it is wonderful to have you join us here on AI Unplugged.
I'm glad to be with you.
We appreciate you so much. You know, I'm going to just jump right in because we've got a lot to talk with you about. There is so much happening in these times around corporate layoffs. You're beginning to hear about them. You hear some attributed to the president's tariffs program, if that's the right term to use for it. Other reasons around uncertainty in the market. Are you sensing whether AI as a displacement of workers is part of what's behind these layoff announcements?
Yes, I think it is. And I think we don't yet have our arms around as a nation, and certainly not as a labor movement, on the scale and speed of the change that these rippled layoffs that we just heard announced, I think are a signal of the future that is only going to escalate.
Do you think that there are certain sectors that are where folks are more at risk?
You know, Deval, I've been asking that question, and it feels to me like every sector of the economy is experiencing some impact from artificial intelligence, often in ways that we don't understand. I think back to 15 years ago when Kaiser Permanente, the healthcare system along the West Coast, introduced robotic housekeeping, and our housekeepers weren't involved in the problem that was trying to solve the design or the work process, but they got involved around the impact of them, and they were clear that the robotic technology didn't understand that the corner of the patient room was one of the most important areas to clean so that there wasn't bacteria or infection for the patient that would then have to return for treatment to the hospital. And so that experience made us think we have to figure out a way that workers are involved at the front end. What problem is the technology or AI trying to solve, or what opportunity is it going to create? How do workers get involved in the process design? And then how are workers retrained and educated for whatever the technology allows them to have more time to do? And I think that's a really key question that we have to figure out, not just employer by employer, but on a scale that AI is operating in.
Mary Kay, I want to come back in a second to something you just said about retraining, but I've just come from San Francisco, where I know you are based. And it's amazing when you're out there how present AI and robotics seems to be just about everywhere you look. So you get in your Waymo to your hotel, you order room service from your hotel, and it's delivered by a robot. So literally, my breakfast coffee and breakfast sandwich was delivered by a robot to my door. And so, I mean, this is a far-reaching technology that seems to be touching lots of places, even in service sectors like the SEIU covers, where you would have thought perhaps that, humans would be more resilient. I mean, how far reaching do you think AI and robotics is likely to be, even in these, sort of so-called caring economy sectors or service sectors where humans traditionally have been a critical part of the delivery?
Yeah, I think it's going to be profound. I was a part of the Stanford AI advisory committee, and Fei-Fei Li, who is a AI developer asked us to have our home care workers talk to engineers about the ways in which their jobs could be made better to care for elders in their home. So there's heat sensors, there's weight sensors, there's so many things that I don't know about you. I couldn't even imagine, 10 to 15 years ago, and the pace of the change and the introduction of things where you thought nobody's going to be able to introduce AI in home care because that's all about a human being caring for another human being and being able to see things. But technology, I think, in the right way, could be incredibly liberating for workers who don't want to do menial tasks over and over, but actually want to be able to make the life of an elder in their home better.
Yeah, Mary Kay, you just touched on something both Warren and I have really was behind our thinking about this podcast in the first place, which is how do we think about AI as enhancing the experience of work rather than just replacing workers? How do we use that tool to enable people to get to the core of the thing that in many cases inspired them to do the work in the first place, that's a really, really great example. And you talked earlier about, and in that example, about the importance of having the worker train the AI on what the job actually is. You're talking about getting into the corners of cleaning up in hospitals in the health system on the West Coast. Can you say some more about that?
Well, I think there's this incredible housekeeper who had been doing the job for 20 years who came to the union and said, listen, we should have been involved on the front end. So it was actually the workers who were impacted by the technology that helped the union design the demand that we workers should partner with the employer to help introduce the change and make things better. And there were ideas that the housekeepers had for how the robot could help and what other technology, because there's a huge issue in hospitals about infection control, as you know. And so it was through a dialogue between the housekeepers, the nurses, the doctors, and the designers of the AI that helped improve it. And it remains today. I think my big concern is if less than 10% of the U.S. workforce is in a union and has the ability to have a voice through their union in the introduction of the technology and the impact, and then what jobs can get created of the ones that are being displaced. What do we do with the 90% of the American workforce that's going to be dramatically impacted? Because we're talking about job change in the tens of millions. And that's why I think the idea of doing things in a sector approach, like I've wondered, could we imagine healthcare employers, representatives of workers and their unions or workers directly and government thinking together about how do we reduce costs, increase productivity, and allow for workers to do the kind of jobs they've always dreamed of having the time to do is really, I think, a key question that we need to tackle. And I have to tell you, I feel like we're very far behind the introduction of the technology, and certainly in the healthcare sector in the U.S., which, as you know, there was a leapfrog to telemedicine over the pandemic. And so change that the healthcare industry thought was going to take 10 more years happened in the 2 years that we were staying at home. And so that pace of change is intensifying too. And I'm sure that's true in hotels that I don't know as well, retail. We've seen it in warehousing through these layoffs that have been announced this week. I think about it as a worker-led agenda for change. Deval, you used to talk to me about this when you were governor of Massachusetts. We have to think beyond retraining and really think about lifelong education. I think AI is going to be such a profound shift. Workers can't expect to just be retrained for the next job. It's like, how are we educated in a way that allows us to move with the impact of this technology on a scale that I think we have yet to imagine?
How do you ensure, especially for unionized workers, how do you ensure that they're not just participating in their own obsolescence? I'm training an AI bot to do what I used to do, and now once the bot's figured it out, I'm not needed anymore. How do you sort of address that question?
Right. Well, 1986, we struck Kaiser for 9 weeks over the question of their introduction of a very sort of minor automation that was happening system wide in terms of the introduction of the electronic medical record that was going to displace all the medical transcriptionists. With these were job displacements in the hundreds, right? Not millions, and out of that grew an appreciation that the employer committed to employment security, not job security, but employment security. So imagine if we could, in a sector like healthcare, I don't think employer by employer can make that commitment given how pervasive AI is in making the change. But imagine if the healthcare sector and the government could commit to every one of the 22 million healthcare workers, hey, everybody's going to have a job. It's just going to be different. We'll maintain your standard of living, but we all need to work together to bring down costs, increase productivity, and create better patient outcomes. As long as workers understand they aren't going to lose their economic security, I've experienced workers being willing to unleash their 20 years of experience to actually make the introduction of technology better for themselves and for the people they serve.
And is there precedent, Mary Kay, for that kind of cross-industry action? That does sound like a really interesting kind of solution, especially in healthcare, by the way, where you've got a supply-constrained industry, where when you unlock labor productivity in healthcare, you actually can just serve more patients and you can serve them better, which I think is in everyone's interests. But that kind of cooperation across industry players strikes me as unusual. But I'd be curious to hear if you've seen precedent for it.
Well, the best example we have in the U.S. is the New York League of Voluntary Hospitals. So there's multiple hospitals that bargain together and create an education and training. They create incumbent workforce training to deal with shortages of registered nurses or shortages of medical assistants. So that's one example. You could argue that there was a time when the big three, U.S. Auto. Now, the introduction of the 6 non-union foreign auto companies that are producing as many cars as U.S. Auto. So that's a sector in transition, but they used to think together about healthcare and pension and things like that. But no, Warren, we don't have as many U.S. examples. Like the Scandinavians, I love the story from the Scandinavian trade union movement with the government and trucking. They wanted trucks to go to driverless vehicles. What the government did was figure out what's the next kind of big sector for all the truck drivers that are in all 3 countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And those truck drivers went into middle schools to talk to kids about, hey, this job that you may see every day is not going to exist when you graduate from high school. We want you to begin to consider other jobs. So they did this sort of very holistic approach to thinking about a just transition. And I think that's the scale that we need to think about it. Early conversation about the just transition from oil and gas to clean energy and the scale we need to think about transitioning those workers into a clean energy economy. I think this is like 10 times the scale, the impact and introduction of AI in our society. Because it's work that is home-based work and work that is in workplaces that is being impacted.
Are there public or private sector leaders who are showing the imagination to lead at that scale, to plan in that holistic a way?
Well, I know our current president of SEIU, April Verrett, has put these ideas out there in terms of sector bargaining and all the other parts of the agenda for change. She's tried to plant the idea of just transition. I know that Liz Schuler at the AFL-CIO is doing it. I think the problem we have is we're still too siloed. We don't have a tripartite table that has business, government, and unions thinking together about how do we create an American way of thinking about the introduction of this change with the goal that you two talked about. Why can't this be unleashing human capital as opposed to this dystopian 50 million people are going to be out of work. I just don't think a substitute for working is going to feed the human spirit. Like that a universal basic income isn't for the displaced healthcare worker or fast food worker satisfying in terms of their meaning and purpose. They want to be able to contribute. That's why I think this is a key conversation that you both are provoking.
There's a way in which when I think about the downside of AI, I think about how backward looking the training is, meaning it harvests what we do, what we have known, the way we behave. And I worry that that may just lock in some bad habits, racial and economic inequities that we have lived with for a long, long time. And I wonder, do you think AI risks widening or presents the opportunity to narrow those kinds of divides, and what kind of role unions might play in pushing for safeguards and accountability?
Yeah, I think given the current path we're on, it definitely risks increasing racial and economic and gender inequity that has been structured into the economy. So I think that's a really key point to raise. I remember the first time the fast food workers struck, that a store manager yelled at the fast food worker, don't worry, we're going to replace you with a robot. Just stay out here. And so technology was used as a threat to workers trying to collectively have a voice on the job. And the worker shouted back, I want to help design the robot because I figured out how to do the job faster than the way you train me. Just as a little example of, hey, workers have a lot of intelligence here that they could contribute, because a lot of these jobs people have been forced to take because there was no other option. And they'd really love to, many fast food workers I've walked with have wanted to be a zoologist or a botanist, or had hoped they could write something, but never got to finish school because the schedules are so erratic at work. So I really think it's a question of power and control in terms of how do we move from it. The current incentive for the introduction of AI is driven by how much money can be made, and is in the hands of very few individuals. And we have like 7 people or companies are kind of driving the policy. And we have an administration currently in the US that has completely deregulated how AI is going to be introduced into our society, and has offered federal funding and resource to the tech companies without equivalent federal funding and resource to business leaders who are adapting it, and workers in their organizations who should all be at a table together. And then the global implications, I have to tell you, I don't know how to wrap my heads around, because all of this deregulation and federal assistance is being promoted as if it's a national security issue in our competition globally. So I think it's a really key point, Deval, and I don't think it has to be all dark. We could create examples where AI could help end the structural inequality on race and gender, and let's create those examples so that those could be scaled as fast as AI surveillance of work that's happening as we speak.
So, Mary Kay, you've talked a bunch about worker voice in tech decisions, and I will say, the firm that I work at owns a couple of healthcare companies, 3 healthcare companies actually, and we've worked with some of the most labor constrained areas of our companies. Worked with the people on the front lines, like counselors in a substance abuse treatment chain. We've worked with the counselors to unlock more patient-centric service and take out some of the documentation. That's worked really well, but we've done it sort of on an ad hoc basis. We've gone in, we've sort of said, okay, we got 300 counselors in this system. Let's talk to them. Let's figure out how to unleash more service. And actually, we've managed to, I think if anything, we're going to probably grow the number of counselors because they're so much more productive. But how do you do that structurally? And is there a way unions can play a role to really catalyze that conversation?
I think that it needs to happen at 3 levels simultaneously. Unions who are doing collective bargaining should be making the demand, and many are, as I understand it, to have some ongoing mechanism, a partnership committee or a technology committee about the introduction of AI and workers' say in it, both in the design, the processes, training. And then I think we should also add a fourth thing that I've heard some unions doing recently, where the way AI increases productivity, that we create like some productivity percentage enhancement to help workers be incentivized to consider the best processes possible. So if you're bargaining over wages, how can we capture the savings that employers are experiencing and reinvest it in the workforce and create new job opportunities? Because I think that would accelerate the innovation. And so that's what I call the workplace or enterprise level. And then I still think unions need to be making sector-wide demands. So if there's 2 million healthcare workers in unions collectively bargaining, how do those unions make a demand on the industry to bargain for the 22 million on this AI impact question? Could we imagine that as an example? And then the third thing is, how does government, labor, and business think about this? I heard a CEO recently say, we can't absorb the inefficiencies, but somebody needs to. And so all the education and lifelong learning that's going to be required shouldn't be my responsibility of my company, but I understand that that should be paid for somehow, because the shift of work is going to be so dramatic. So that's why I think we need to operate on 3 levels simultaneously and share the positive examples. And I just heard recently that the government of Pennsylvania and our local union there have created the design committee. And they're bringing in the engineers and developers to have a dialogue directly with the workers. And a year ago, those engineers and designers were introduced sort of under the cover of darkness, and the workers knew somebody like, why are you in my DMV and what are you doing here? The consultants didn't ever describe the role. Well, they were trying to figure out how to improve the process with AI, but without a dialogue with the union. So that got stopped, and now a dialogue is happening, and the workers are kind of jazzed by it. I think the future of work is less about technology and more about power and who holds it. And are we willing to consider at every level sharing power? Or can government play a role in figuring out a way to incent the sharing of power so that we aren't a nation with 80 million people unemployed in 10 years.
What are we going to do? We're going to freeze everybody where they are if they, and then give them some UBI, universal basic income. That's not an attractive future. And then all the, that all the power is controlled by the 7 people or however many there are that actually control it, that we need it. So I sometimes try when in my darkest moments, I try to think, what is the way this could go well?
That's what you think about in your darkest moments?
Well, when I'm feeling sad, I think of how this could go well. And one of the things that occurred to me was, I spent a couple years working in France, and we literally had a 38-hour work week. We literally had to take 7 weeks of vacation per year. And I was working at a large consulting firm, and that was just the way it worked. Like, you had to do it. It was company mandated, it was government mandated. And actually, it was quite a nice way to do things. You could imagine sharing gains, keeping the same number of people employed, but as they get more productive, you could share gains between the owners of capital as well as the workers and their lifestyle. I think there's many workers who would probably be very happy to work 4 days instead of 5 if that could be unlocked somehow. And yet they could still have their affiliation with their job. They could still have their earning power and mobility.
When I think about the introduction of the idea of a shorter work week or less time at work, and the way you just described the French having a government mandated system of 7 weeks vacation and was it 38-hour work week?
38-hour work week, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember the UAW just being laughed at for making a demand 2 years ago of a 32-hour work week for the auto workers.
Thinking about this, the French mandates, government mandates, and a point you were making earlier about how important it is to have these conversations happening simultaneously across sectors. I'm mindful of the fact that when it comes to a lot of worker related policy making, it comes afterwards, reacting to the transition. And you've mentioned a conversation underway right now in Pennsylvania at the state level. Are there other examples of policies or policy approaches that are about trying to anticipate impact?
Well, I know that the AFL-CIO and SEIU and MIT have thought together about how do workers get involved in 4 phases. And the first is identifying the problem. I think it's not just identifying the problem, it's also identifying the opportunity. That's how our home care members thought about, like, what opportunity is there for AI to make the quality of my care better in the home? So it could be both and. The second is, how do we change the work processes and design in the way that Warren talked about? The workers are the experts, having done it over and over and actually created their own improvement without it being scaled as a system. And then the third is this education and training. Like, how do people get educated and trained to move through the transition? And then ensuring a just transition on the scale of the change that's going to be unleashed by the introduction of the AI, and getting the just compensation or the sharing in the gain, I think, are the 4 phases that many unions are trying to introduce directly with their employers. And the concrete examples I'm aware of are in the entertainment industry between SAG-AFTRA, the Writers Guild, and the big entertainment companies in the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm sure there's other public sector efforts underway. In healthcare, Kaiser Permanente, New York League are doing it. And I know that the UAW in their last Big 3 contract talked about it as well. Those are the ones that I'm aware of that are using this 4-phase process in their bargaining and creating a labor management partnership to actually implement it.
Gotcha.
And Mary Kay, is there, do you know of any organized labor organizations using AI as a tool for themselves? Are there places where it's helping with organizing?
You know, I can't wait for more experimentation to be done on that because, yes, I know that SEIU, our union, is trying to think about how do we improve our members' experience in getting answers and services they need? And then how do we increase connections between non-union workers who are trying to build a union, across geographies?
Mary Kay, you've spent a lifetime fighting for workers. Are you hopeful that we're going to be able to navigate this, this abrupt change? Do you think, and do you feel like unions are well positioned to help cushion the change that's coming?
Well, it's interesting. Hope is not a passive activity for me. So the way I get hopeful is by learning about these I think of them as pilot efforts because we need to scale them fast in order to have the impact. So I'm hopeful that there are individual leaders in geographies trying, and I'm hopeful that there are national leaders like April Verrett that are pushing the boundaries. And that makes me believe that we can create what I think of as the American version of this, how to make AI win-win, as you talk about, unleashing the full capacity of our human talent alongside of transforming how work gets done.
Mary Kay, we are so fortunate that you joined us on the podcast for this episode. So fortunate to have had your leadership for so long in thinking about just transitions of a whole variety of kinds. And I feel so fortunate to call you a friend. Thanks so much for joining us.
And likewise, Deval, thank you so much. And great to meet you, Warren. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you, Mary Kay. Deval, what an amazing guest. Thank God the world has Mary Kay Henry and workers have Mary Kay Henry to look out for them.
Well, the fact is not everybody feels that way. I do, but her point about how the future of work is not about technology, it's about power. About, we're at this intersection where we're trying to sort out not just winners and losers, but who has a stake in those wins and losses. And I thought her idea of collaborative problem solving, of these tripartite conversations, sector-wide, industry-wide, with government and business and workers, whether those workers are represented or not, is really important.
Yeah, I do think that's a concept that I hadn't thought about, but I think if you can get those three groups together, you might be able to meet everybody's interests. If this really is as much of a productivity gain as I think some people think it's likely to be, there ought to be more than enough to go around. But that's not, as you know, that's not always the way our economy solves problems. Sometimes, productivity improvements like this further concentrate power. And so I think that feels like a point of tension that we should be exploring as we continue through this season.
Well, I'll just say, Warren, two things as a former policymaker. I think one of the powers I realized I had that I hadn't realized I would have when I was running for governor is the convening power. You could get just about anybody to return your call and accept an invitation to come and sit around your conference table. And you could get them to do that alongside folks they might not otherwise sit down with. And we got some of our best solutions that way. I'm thinking in particular about the expansion of healthcare. This is before the ACA. But the second thing is that government actually does have a stake in the sorting out what these outcomes are. And it's mostly has to do with if there is profound displacement, as some have predicted, the consequences of that have historically fallen to government. And the cost of that has been borne collectively by taxpayers through government. So I think there's a reason why government should be at the table alongside industry, alongside workers, sorting out the best way to think about how to harvest the gains of AI, but also to think about how to share those gains.
Well, Deval, the future of work is not about technology, it's about power. I think that'll be the line that sticks with me. Well, and now, why don't we turn to the news? Deval, a recent Wall Street Journal article called the AI tech revolution the most joyless revolution ever. So while Wall Street greets AI with open arms, ordinary Americans respond with ambivalence, anxiety, and even dread. So if you look back to 1995, a survey apparently found that more than 70% of respondents were comfortable with new technologies such as computers and the internet. But today, just over 30% of people are comfortable with the new technologies like AI, and more than 2/3 are actually uncomfortable, which came out of a survey that CNBC did. So like the .com era, AI bubble is going to have its excesses and so forth. But unlike the sort of joyfulness that surrounded and the optimism that surrounded the internet, it seems like people are walking into the AI age with fear.
That sounds right to me, based on some of the guests we've had. But what would we expect, right? We're being told that this is a profound change, unlike anything in living memory, including the .com explosion and the explosion of optimism that went with it in the 90s. We're being told there will be profound impact, but we're not told exactly what that impact is. And I think the first thing people ask themselves is, how's it going to affect me? Am I going to be out of work? What do I do with the time, and how do I have the resources to support myself and my family? Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that it's a joyless tech revolution, but it doesn't have to be. The tech leaders can make it a joyful revolution if they emphasize AI as supporting human productivity and meaning, and not just replacing. But having said all that, here's the news article. Travel agents beware. According to business technology website ZDNet, travel agents should be looking over their shoulders as AI tools become better at planning vacations and business trips. You can now describe a trip to Google and get a full itinerary. Canvas will visualize your trip, including flights and hotels. AI agents can also act independently to do booking and payment. And soon, Warren, I think the implication here is that they will take the vacation that they have organized for you.
Well, if you have good enough virtual reality glasses, perhaps you just do the whole vacation from your couch. I used to think that some of the fun of travel was planning it, but perhaps that's a thing of the past. Another piece in the news. So according to a tech news website, Microsoft's AI effort wants you to know that as it works towards superintelligence, it wants to keep humans at the top of the food chain. Microsoft AI's head, Mustafa Suleyman, is calling their effort humanist superintelligence. So the idea that this really is, AI and AGI in service of us flesh and blood humans. What do you think of that, Deval?
Well, I'd love it to be true. Of course, at the same time, they're involved in the same AI arms race as the other leaders in the field. But listen, we've talked before about the importance of leadership here in setting the tone and setting a tone we hope that is supportive of working people and not just about numbers on a page. So maybe it's true, but they're in it right now, right alongside the folks whose leaders do not seem to be focused in the same way.
I do think that even if it is lip service, although one hopes that it isn't completely, at least the more that people are talking about humans in this context and talking less about cost reduction and celebrating advances that support humans over advances in replacement, that at least seems to me like a step in the right direction.
Well, from your lips to Microsoft's ears.
And that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining AI Unplugged. From my partner, Deval Patrick.
And my partner, Warren Valdmanis. Take care.